obviously everybody's favorite question, and no one has the answer to it, is like, when pivot, when pivot.
Yeah.
Luke Groman was saying August, which I think is I really respect the hell out of Luke and his opinions on things. I think that's a little bit early.
That's aggressive.
Um, that's very aggressive. But just in terms of, I think the train's coming off the tracks real fast here. And Sam and I are joking. We send each other economic data, every day, and we've yet to send to see one good looking chart over the last month, with just all this, like the deterioration of data and public sentiment. But just kind of, what are your thoughts on the rest of 2022 and maybe 2023?
Yeah, that liquidation of government debt paper, it's really interesting because it does outline the playbook, which is allow inflation to run hot, suppress yields so that they're below inflation, and over time the debt just kind of dissolves away. But the problem that they have run into now, which you alluded to, Dylan, is the inflation has gotten too high, right? It can't sit at 8-9% year over year. And part of that reason it's so high is because of things out of the control of the Fed at this point. Supply chain constraints, China's zero COVID policy, and Russia invading Ukraine. All of those have exacerbated what really started in 2020. Obviously, fiscal stimulus created a lot of demand, and then after we reopened the economy, that didn't help either. But inflation has gotten far out of control for them. And so I think that the playbook of, let's just let it run a little steamy, as Janet Yellen has even said in the past, like, we're open to the idea, before she was Treasury Secretary, I think back when she ran the Fed, she said something to the extent of, it's even okay for us to let inflation run above target for a period of time, as long as the economy seems like it's doing okay. And you would think maybe they're doing that to a degree here. Maybe they don't want inflation to just all of a sudden vanish back down to 1%, because it is helping whittle away the debt. Like you mentioned on my chart, it is annual. If you look at it by quarter, it does go up to 136, but my chart was an annual average. But you can see it goes up to about 130 or so, and it's come down to about 124, 125% debt to GDP. So it has worked to a degree, but because it's so high, and because there are some serious structural issues in the economy that might make high costs remain stubborn, it's driving a lot of social unrest, like kind of just simmering under the surface. It's flat out, revolt in certain countries, but here in the United States, it's still just kind of brewing under the surface. It's obviously the #1 topic for voters in a midterm election year. And I think in some ways, like you said, you and Sam are like looking at all this data, and it just keeps getting worse and worse. And you're absolutely right. And it feels like in some ways that they're just trying to keep the wheels on the bus until we get through the election, right? Because then afterwards they can all kind of relax, and we can just kind of let the economy deteriorate. Because I think if they don't want to have to talk about stimulating the economy or helping cover costs for working class citizens who lose their jobs because they've caused so much economic stress before we even get to the election, right? And so I don't know, they're in a really tough position here. Like I said, there are a lot of signs that maybe inflation kind of sticks around, that it doesn't come back down to 2 or 2.5% anytime soon. Maybe it stays elevated at 4 or 5 or 6% or worse. And if that's the case, what does it look like when the Fed does have to flip dovish in that environment? When people are forced to spend considerably more on non-discretionary things than they did in the past, like shelter and food and gas to drive to their jobs. What does that look like for the economy? If they can't spend freely and drive expansion and speculate and do all the things that really produce an exciting bull market for market participants. How do we create that in an environment with stubbornly high costs for things that people must pay for? I don't know that we have a good answer for that. There's certainly not a recent model for that exact environment, and definitely not in the QE era. And every time in the past, like the last thing, or one of the things you mentioned, when is the Fed going to pivot? When they pivoted in 2020, which produced that, hilarious, absurd, straight up market for so long, CPI was at 1.5%, and the market fell 35% in a single month. So the environment was quite different. It was much more panicky. The future was even less certain than it is now, and inflation was considerably lower. But that's not where we are now. So I think that none of the outcomes available to them are particularly attractive at this point.